Hello, brethren. How are you doing today? Hope everybody is having a good weekend. NFL got the playoffs going on, so I got to get this in early. And there's some basketball games on. I know you brothers want to watch, so I got to get this in early as soon as possible. So drop a one if you guys can hear me. So today we're continuing on with Hoffman. So the American Negro. It was published by American Economic Association. All right, so this is the final chapter. All right, so this is the finale. So get your popcorn, relax. Okay, and the book we're reading is The Race Traits and the Tendencies of the American Negro. Okay, and we also are doing this as a companion piece to the great work that G Dub actually put out. So let's get into it. So, finale. And yes, this is a finale. Chapter 6 Conclusion. All of the vulgar modes of escaping from the consideration of the effects of social and moral influences on the human mind. The most vulgar is the attribution of diversity of conduct and character of the inherent natural divisions or difference, excuse me. The central fact deductible from results in this investigation into the traits and tendencies of the colored population of the country. They also meant Native Indigenous too, so just in case you didn't know, is plainly and emphatically the most powerful influence on race in the struggle for life. In marked contrast with frequent assertions such as that of Mill, that race is not important and that the environment or the conditions of life are the most important factors in the final result of the struggle for life, individuals as well as social. We have here an abundant evidence that we find that race and heredity, the determining factors in the upward or downward course of mankind. In the field of statistical research, and I posit that his statistical research is quite flawed because it's based on bias. So it had inherent bias built in. So, you know, so because he had an inherent bias built in to his research and statistical findings, okay, it can't be honorable and honest. So it came from a position of pseudoscience and pseudo statistical gathering and flawed sample sizes and incongruent sample sizes. The data, which have been here brought together in a convenient form, he literally wrote that, form speak for themselves. Okay. From the standpoint of the impartial investigator, no difference of interpretation of the meaning seems possible. The decrease in the rate of increase in the colored population. Hold up. The decrease in the rate of increase. Okay, I think I get what he's saying. And the colored I didn't write this. He wrote it. Has been traced first to the excessive mortality. Okay. And we know why there was mortality, but so-called black man had a very high birth rate at this point. Um, During his time, it was about a 7-to-1 ratio, and depending on different rural farms, so in rural areas, you're talking about 9 to 10. Okay, with your white population about 5 to 6 at that time, because they're mostly living either in factories or on farms. And homes use social engineering, and they did so by designing homes to have very few rooms, two, some three. Okay, especially your larger cities. So they wanted a very small family size and formation. But that's just more of a population controlling of the troublesome populace that was coming in from overseas, from Europe specifically. So, uh, so high mortality and has been traced to an inferior vital capacity. The mixture of the African with the white, let's go up to the top, race has been shown to have a serious effect of the longevity of the former and left as a heritage to the future generations the poisons of scrofolia. That, for you guys who don't know what that is tuberculosis. So Okay, there it is, tuberculosis, and most of all, to syphilis. Now, syphilis was mostly a disease that was brought in by a lot of Europeans, and it wasn't as common as we showed in numerous charts, unless there was interracial, as they so say, contact. By that, somebody was shacking up, and who was shacking up at ease in that period? It was a lot of sailors, a lot of people that were coming in that were brought in as soldiers. Some were actually poor, and they were drafted or conscripted in order to pay off debts. Some were actually brought in to work as laborers in factories, indentured bond contracts to pay for their passage. Okay, and yes, they did have syphilis because they were having a lot of unprotected sex. Okay, with whores, and we don't want to get too off subject, but most of your whorehouses were actually run by madams, and quite a bit of the trade that connects to prostitution and the hidden hand was mostly guided by women. So a lot of your sex trafficking of European women was actually upheld and maintained by European women, madams, powerful madams, specifically in New York. New York had some, and New Jersey had some very powerful madams. Very. But I digress. All right, let's get back into it. Now, where were we at? Okay. The racial inferiority has turned okay, so this racial inferiority has in turn brought about a moral deterioration, such as in rarely met with civilized countries at the present time, already subject to an inordinate rate of mortality, especially from all the most destructive diseases, the sexual immorality prevalent between colored females, notice he said that, and white males of lower type. Yeah, there was white men that were, like I said before. See, I didn't even get into this. I haven't read this yet, so I haven't taken notes on this. So we're reading this as you're reading it. So they knew that white men, so-called, it wasn't just lower white men because men of all stations were actually they were imbued to have sexual contact with so-called black women. And, at the end of the day, sometimes it was consensual. Some of the women sought out that situation, trying to get the that social advantage and opportunities from having a child from said men. Some just because they may like the features. It is what it is. Others were actually whores that were involved in sexual escapades and trysts with so-called white men, and some were slaves. You have some so-called black women that came from Europe that had their passage paid and weren't very good workers, weren't very good laborers. So some of them actually were able to work off their time by going over these powerful whorehouses and houses of leisure, aka sporting men. So they were able to go over these houses and pay off a lot of their passage and then be free. And some went out west. And you had a lot of women, some of your black Europeans that came over that went out west when you had the 1840s, aka the 49ers, because of the gold. And you had a lot of panhandlers that went out there also in order to search for fortune, and quite a bit of women, so-called black, mostly Asian and Hispanic and Native indigenous, actually got married due to the fact that out west there's very few women. They had a high mortality rate amongst the men and women due to the numerous wars against the different Native indigenous people and just disease, poor hygiene, disease. A lot of people just died. A lot of people just died. So those men were like, look, we got to shack up with whomever is here. We can't be picky. Beggars can't be picky. So they were like, all right, all right, all right, all right. We can't be picky. So, yeah, we got to shack up whoever we can shack up with. So this was a mating strategy done by a lot of so-called Black European women and some indigenous women here, and Black women that were able to buy themselves out of slavery. Oftentimes, that her main mission was due to either the master or the person that she was connected to, just freeing her because they had placage type situations. They had situations where she was really the mistress, fancy maids, things of that nature. But back into this. I don't want to go too long. So, colored females has also brought about the diminished power of vital resistance amongst the young, as it is to be expected from the recognized fact that the death rate for illegitimate children is about twice that of children born in wedlock, of course. And that's due to the fact that at that point you had a much different economic system, very different. So if a woman decided to have a kid out of wedlock, she was not spared many social networks and social systems that are in place currently to actually reduce the harsh burden. She had to work, and sometimes she just didn't have time to actually look after the kid because she had to work. So yeah, that was kind of a death knell if she had for a kid, if she had a kid out of wedlock. And she wasn't around family, especially if she was in bigger cities. She moved there and she didn't have a strong family connection like in rural or agrarian areas where they had extended family. But often she would be shamed, so she wouldn't actually have a kid out of wedlock, most women, so-called Black women. As a general result, there was a diminishing social and economic efficiency, which in course of the years must prove not only most destructive factor in the progress of the colored race, but also in progress social as well as economic of the white race brought under its influence. Racial inferiority was a keynote of the pro-slavery argument. On one hand, racial differences were explained away by those who saw in freedom the sure prospect of speedy amelioration of the lot of Southern slavery. Now, there was also Northern slavery. Yet 30 years of freedom in this country and nearly 60 in the West Indies have failed to accomplish the original purpose of the abolition of slavery, that is, the elevation of the colored race in the moral, mental, and economic level of the white race. Nothing is more clearly shown from the investigation than that of the Southern Black man at the time of emancipation has a healthy body and is cheerful in mind. Okay, here we go. He neither suffered inordinately from disease nor from impaired bodily vigor. His industrial capacity, here comes the cap, as a laborer were not of a low order, nor was the condition of servitude such as to produce in him morbid conditions favorable to mental disease, suicide, or intemperance. What are the conditions 30 years after? The pages of this work give one answer, the answer which is most severe condemnation of modern attempts of superior race to lift the inferior races, their own elevated position, and answer the full meaning, seem criminal indifference to the part of civilized people to ignore the plain language of the facts brought together. The color race is shown to be more a downgrade, tending towards a condition which matters will be worse when they are now. The disease will be more destructive, vital resistance still lower. When the number of births will fall below the deaths, the gradual extinction of the race take place. So he's talking about, so-called Black race would be extinct. And this is the premise of his work. Neither religion nor education nor higher degree of economic well-being will be able to raise the race from the low and antisocial conditions of a condition really fostered by very influences which it asserts will soon raise the race to a place even more elevated than that of the whites. Okay, so this is what he believes. So basically, what he's saying is that, you know, you can throw as much money as you want towards them, and it ain't really improve. Any education ain't really improve. Now, it is not in the conditions of life, but in race and heredity that we find the explanation of the fact of the observed in all parts of the globe, in all times, and among all people, namely the superiority of one race over another, and of the Aryan race overall. See, he doesn't know what Aryan is, but okay. To what must we attribute this superiority? To what inherent traits must we attribute to the marvelous conquest of the nature of the Aryan race? Again, he doesn't know what Aryan is. I cannot do better than quote from a work of Mr. Morris. Okay, let's see what Mr. Morris said. If the Negro is indolent, both physically and mentally, the Mongolian energetic physicality but undeveloped mentality, and the melancholy. Oh, okay. So we're going melancholy. Okay. Active physically and to some extent mentally. In the Aryan, we find a highly vigorous. Now, the way melancholy, remember we did this in another video. Melancholy really connects to a very lighter, okay, I guess European, and the Mongolian would be more or less like a Asian, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they're supposed to be like lighter, okay, which they trace back their ancestry to, which is why they're given such high praise. Mentality, Aryan, vigorous, developmental activity, da 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 da. Though by no means lacking in physical energy, the mind is the ruling agent in this race. Muscular work is reduced to the lowest level, consistent with the demands of the body. And this, see, what he's trying to do is trying to say, okay, look, we don't really need all that muscle. We develop our minds. So we don't need the extra testosterone, which actually helps with, it helps not just develop muscle, but it helps increase your heart. It helps send blood flow through your body. It helps increase in testosterone, and increased testosterone makes you more capable of repairing your muscular physical frame. It makes you more capable of actually carrying the seed of life and having successful births. Okay. So what he's trying to say is that we don't really need a whole bunch of muscle and physical fitness. We can be thin and out of shape and just disgusting looking, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Our mind is what we develop. Now, from an esoteric concept, they always say that one cannot do without everything working at full capacity. So one cannot function with just the mind. The mind without the body is incomplete. You need both to work in full congruency in order to have a complete self. You cannot elevate the mind without first elevating the body. So you must work them both. So when you learn, you must also train. So muscular work is reduced to the lowest level, consistent with the demands of the body and the intellect, and every effort is made to limit the quantity of work represented by the fixed quantity of the product. Now, most Europeans that came over to America, unless they were criminals or the lowest of the lowest, they didn't really work a lot of manual labor. Okay, unless they were the lowest of the lowest. As they say, give us your poor, your weak, your destitute, your paupers, your criminals, this or that. Okay, so they didn't really want to do much manual labor. And this actually is consistent in numerous societies, civilizations, like you have in Asia. In Asia, you have interesting concept, which most people don't know about. But every now and then you can see aspects of it. And that's based on elite, and that's based on different feudal systems, different stratifications of caste, where they would believe that stoop labor and manual labor would be something reduced to the poor or impoverished. And they would pride themselves on being very fair of skin, which means they're not out in the sun much. Okay. So this same mentality carried not just from Europe, but over to Asia. So you have influences in numerous societies and empires and governances where they believe that, that physical type of like, it's not for us. And so this is more of like a class-based thing, what he's trying to discuss, but he's going to get into the racism part in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And intellect and every effort is made to limit the quantity of work represented in a fixed quantity of product. Working harder, not smarter, is not bad. Waste labor, here he goes, is a crime to the Aryan mind. So that's what they think of so-called white men that currently work in construction, that currently work as sewage, install floors, that work in carpet insulation, that work for electrical companies as electrician. That's waste labor. It's a crime to the Aryan mind. See, this is where we're getting. Told you, we want to get there. Use is the guiding principle in all efforts. It is to this ruling agency of the intellect over the energies of the muscular and active organisms that we owe the superior quality and restricted dimensions and the vast quantity of Aryan labor products. And this and his work, pure thought, is far more represented than pure labor. So this is where you get some of the vestiges of your white collar is better than blue collar or everyday labor. But unfortunately, what happens is history repeats itself. You have a mass of white collar workers who are functionally useless, who build nothing, who sit in offices, create nothing, invent nothing. They just consume. And eventually you are going to need somebody to build something out because not everything's peaches and creams. And unfortunately, societies, they need people to maintain upkeep. And if you believe that this is, as you say, a crime, waste labor is a crime to the Aryan mind. Okay. So they're talking about you. So any trolls, the so-called white guys who want to come up there, they think that if you're not working in an office making 350 to a million a year, you're a waste laborer and you're not a true Aryan. In their opinion, it's not what I wrote. This is what he wrote. It's messed up. This is what they think of you. Okay. Okay. That's what they think of you, bro. So at the end of the day, if this is what you want to practice, and this is, they don't even really respect you, so called white guys, if you're working in those jobs that are not at the top echelon. If we consider the Negro race, it is to find a lack of energy, both physically and mentally. Nowhere in the region inhabited by this race do we perceive indications of high powers of either work or thought. There you go. No monuments of architect appear. That's a lie. No philosophies, also a lie. Or literatures have arisen. That's also a lie. And in their present condition, they stand mentally at a very low level, while physically they confine themselves to labor absolutely necessary for existence. There you go. They neither work nor do they see, here comes the cap, nor do they think above the lowest level of life needs. And even in America, under the investigation of Aryan activity, the Negro race scarcely displays any voluntary energy either to thought or work. It goes only as far as a sharp wit necessary to drive looks upon the indolences and the sunshines of terrestrial paradise. So you're scatterbrained, so-called black man. The white race has a great physical vigor, capacity, and endurance, and has an intensity of will and desire that is controlled by intellect or intellectuality. Great things are undertaken readily but not blindly. It manifests a strong utilitarianism, united with the powerful imaginations which elevates, ennobles, and idealizes the practical ideals. The Negro can only imitate. The Chinese only utilize the work of the white. Oh my gosh. Yo, they going at everybody. Okay. They going at Chinese too, huh? And this is a guy that actually influenced many of your statistical charts, many of your life insurance companies, many of your annuity companies, many of your insurances that would use rates and ratios to actually pay out the property values. And let's say there's a tragedy or something like that that happens, like a fire, because back then you had fires, electrical or whatnot. they would value your property that you own and your land. It could be right across the street from a railroad track, same city. They'll value your land, so-called black man, as far less, even though the same ground, same grass, the same crops, same everything, but they value it less. And this is what he was. Okay, let's get back into it. But the latter is abundantly able to produce new works. So they're basically saying that Chinese didn't have the imagination. They can only utilize what white men created. That's what he put down. He's racist. He has a keen sense of order as a yellow man, but from a love of repose. However, but from the desire to protect and preserve his acquisition, he has a love for liberty far more intense than exists in the black or yellow races. I guess so. He included all races within, so there's what Japanese, Korean, etc. And he clings to life most earnestly. The high sense of honor is the faculty unknown to other races. All right. So this is the Aryan race and origins of achievement, page 277/8. All right. Even so highly developed type of mind that the Negro submitted to, it has been millions of individual cases to close contact with minds and most aggressive types to enjoy as it has. In many thousands of individual cases, the advantages of liberal education has never, so far as I can ascertain, executed one single stroke of original work in any single department of intellectual activity. The mental education of man. Okay? Wow. So, they show no indications his sensations are less intense and either black or yellow, and his mentality is far more developed and energetic. Thus, the Aryan stands as a type of intellectual man that central outcomes and races, special conditions of dark and light, north and south, emotional practices have been mingled and combined into the highest and noblest state, mind and body. There you go. They know the mind and body is essential from an esoteric standpoint. So, what does this all mean? Well, it means a lot of things. The first thing that it means is that, as the great G. would always say, and I wrote it down, he said, and I quote, books were the first things used in order to push racial pseudoscience before Birth of a Nation actually came into the screen. So these books, these works, these articles, these so-called scientific articles written at Ivy League universities, at the halls of academia, were the first things that are actually used to push racial rhetoric, racial lies. Okay. Before the film industry came into existence, these books were so popular that they sold hundreds of thousands to millions of copies, were put out, pushed through New York Post, LA Times, Washington Post, Chicago Tribune. Okay. This was the precursor to anything else that exists on film. This was what they used in order to shape the image of the so-called black man. Your academics, pseudoscientists, I call them. In other words, the Aryan races possessed of all the essential characteristics that make for success in the struggle for a higher life. Is that so? In contrast with the other races, with lack in one or the other in determining qualities, a statement so far reaching must needs have a considerable body of fact and its support. The whole history of the human effort is a witness to the fact that no other race since the Aryan appeared on the scene has in the end been able to resist the onward march of progressive civilization. That's a cap. That's a huge cap. See, guys like this don't understand history, or they try to obscure and hide what real history is. So let's give you a little bit of historical congruency that he is incongruently looking over. So you look at the Minoan civilization, Okay. And then you look at the Greek civilization. Ancient Greek was polyethnic. And who influenced the Greeks were the Etruscans. To this day, your Pope actually carries an Etruscan staff. The Greeks had numerous leaders of state that were so called ebony men. Ancient Rome was also polyethnic. But if we go back to Greece, the Spartans, who actually held the military state of Greece, they were basically your high level military officers, were so called ebony men. Frank Miller actually has a graphic novel before they made 300 movie depicting in actual form what the so-called Spartans looked like. They were ebony men, dreads. Okay, they were not running around without armor on their chest like in the movie. You have ancient Egypt. Now, I have my positions on ancient Egypt. One thing I do not agree with, which was practiced in part of Rome and Greece, was the marriage between family members. Okay, to keep power in the family. Because of such a close genetic sequencing, you have a lot of abnormalities and a lot of inbreeding, which I'm not a fan of. All right, but ancient Egypt helped influence both Rome and Greece. In Pompeii, for you guys, let's see. So in Pompeii, they actually had reliefs on the walls of stately houses. In Pompeii, they actually had depictions of the Egyptian goddess Isis, and they had a cult of Isis. Now, I'm not here to push polytheism or ancient cult worship, because Pompeii was rife with homosexuality, the engagement between men and men. It was a myriad of different things that was interesting. But they actually had reliefs of the god Isis, and she's a so-called black woman with curly hair. And they later changed Isis into Fortuna, because Isis, the code of Isis, saw Isis as good fortune, wealth. Okay, so this is where you get Fortuna from. They also practiced numerous ancient gods and god worships, and they were so-called ebony men all throughout that area. Throughout the Dark Ages, so-called black men and some North African Berber men came up to Europe after the fall of Europe during Roman Empire once they collapsed, due to the Germanic tribes actually going out and engaging in numerous looting and destruction of numerous towns and cities. Okay. So your so-called Moorish men, so-called ebony men, ruled from 700 all the way up until infighting, wars, one of which was a 100-year war, actually start plaguing and started affecting the civilizations that they helped build out. There was universities throughout most of southern Spain and Portugal and parts of France that were established by so-called ebony men. Okay, you go back to ancient Europe, uh, you have civilizations that existed pre BC that were so-called ebony people, specifically in England. You had the Bengal lady where they pulled up her coffin in England. You had the so-called Highland, so the Scottish Picts and Petes and Highlanders. You had Aboriginals, so-called ebony men throughout Europe, and women, Scottish, Irish, Welsh. But I digress. I'm not trying to go on some long tangent. Sorry about that. So to answer your question, I mean the Greeks. Yes, the Greeks were influenced. They influenced by the Etruscans. Okay, the Romans, they took aspects of different cultures and civilizations, and they mirrored that into their religious center. But the Greeks actually had Etruscan staffs, and they actually had Etruscan literature, and they also went to the mystery schools of the Egyptians, which the Egyptians carried some of their mystery school knowledge from the Babylonians. And the Babylonians, again, another polyethnic society, and you had so-called ebony men. Now you can look at some of the reliefs of the Babylonians, and you can see so-called men with dreads, long braids. And if you're a man that is actually looking, whether it's in the Quran or the Torah or the Old Testament of the Bible, quite a bit of your ancient civilizations were so-called ebony men. Okay, all right, and you see ancient reliefs of different temples where you have biblical people bowing down to different rulership and eras, and you can't tell the difference between who is who. You had in the Old Testament different prophets and different people of importance who trace their history back. But I'm not trying to get into a religious conversation on this stream. But, so getting back into it, the contrast between white and colored race, we have a most complete historical proof of racial superiority. That's a cap. Most of your kings of ancient Europe, okay, quite a bit of them, specific to a specific point, were so-called ebony men. The superiority extends into all the intricate and complex phenomena in life. Whether the white man has gone, wherever he's going, he has become a master of the conditions of life. That's also not true. The whole history of the Anglo-Saxon conquest, again, they don't understand what Saxon is. Conquest and colonization is one endless proof of race superiority and race supremacy. All right, in countries where the very forces of nature were first against him, he has, after years of struggle, gained his end and mastered the conditions of life surrounding him. That's also a cap, because they never were able to make inroads into Africa. Malaria, heat, monotony of different diseases, also different tribal wars. They were never able to make their inroads into Africa, specifically into the subcontinent, very far. Okay. And Africa's not a jungle. It's mostly prairie land. So it's long, vast swaths of land that are flat. It's not a jungle. All right. There's more jungle in Europe than that of Africa, but they were not able to actually conquer that. So they actually set up along the coastal lines, and you have a book written by a Danish woman, and it was the Daughters of the Trade. So it discussed so-called African women mating and having children with so-called white men amongst the coastline. Sometimes that's due to power. Different chiefs were engaging in trade, so they'll often give their daughters to different men in order to extract guns, gunpowder, different things of that nature, et cetera, et cetera. Because, you have a bunch of daughters. I mean, it was a good faith type thing. All right. And sometimes the woman went up and had sex with these men because they just liked them. That's what they were interested in. It is what it is. So be it. It has been shown in this work how the morality of the white troops in the West Indies have gradually decreased during the past 70 years. It may not be out of place to give a few additional facts. In the abbreviated table below, I give you some of the most important statistics bearing the questionability of the white race to live in the tropics. Here are 4 large sections on a very long period of existence in the British and Dutch armies in the East and West Indies. Without exception, fall in the death rate has been very great. Let's look at this chart. Okay. Okay. Let's see. What do we see in this chart? Again, this is the first time I'm seeing this. I did not read this. I want to see what it was. Mortality of the British troops in Bengal. All right. So it did reduce. That's because a lot of wars were going on, and you had a lot of sickly men coming over, being conscripted and drafted. A lot of prisoners that were actually being conscripted in, and they just weren't in good health either anyway. So of course there would be a improvement. All right, all right. So I guess that's in India. That's in the West Indies, 78. In the East Indies, okay. All right. Were not the conditions of life extremely unfavorable for the white race in these countries in the early part of the century? Yeah, of course, because you're at war with people. Is not the climate the same? The heat still is oppressive. The jungle still has malarious, and life itself is totally different from that of home. You don't have as many wars. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. You didn't have as many wars. Okay. Even if it's admitted. All right. So he's going into more capping. Let's go to the next page. The race will be able to improve its conditions still further, to adapt itself still more completely to the prevailing conditions, and thanks to superior race traits and consequent moral, intellectual, and economic superiority, in the end, to become absolute master of the conditions of life, even what were formerly considered the most fatal regions of the earth. Let us consider one experiment of this kind. The colonization of Algeria by France was most bitterly opposed 50 years ago. In numberless instances, the claim was made never under any circumstances could the French population become so acclimated that it would increase and multiply. Major Tulloch, who wrote extensively on the mortality of the white race in tropics during the first 50 years of present century, in his paper on the mortality amongst her majestic troops and colonies, he speaks of the colonization of Algiers as follows: to ascertain a race of men best fit to inhabit and develop the resources of different colonies is most important inquiry, and one which has hitherto attached too little attention both in this and to other countries. Had the government of France, for instance, adverted to the absolute impossibility of any population increase, keeping the numbers under the annual mortality of 7%, it would have never entered into his wild speculation of cultivating the soil of Africa by Europeans, nor has wasted 100 million sterlings. Wow, 100 million sterlings, which no other result than the loss of 100,000 men who have fallen victims to the climate of that country. In such questions, military returns properly organized, proper suggestive for the most useful guides to direct the policy of colonial legislator. They point out the limits intended by nature for particular races within alone can thrive and increase. Now, let me get through the cap on this. All right, so in Algeria, all right, you had so-called men that were actually from that region, your Berbers, that actually came up, were conscripted in. Some were actually connected to your military troops and garrisons and went down and fought. So they're going back home. So they're used to that area. You also have French that were so-called black men. One very popular French man that became a general was Dumas. And he had a statue actually in France until during World War II, Hitler melted it down and used it for artillery shells. So Dumas, the grandson, wrote the Three Musketeers. All right. So I think they replaced the French did, but they're trying to pull the cap yet again, and they hide history. So they put like these shackles as a BS representation of Dumas, who was never a fucking slave. He was a freedman and a general. Matter of fact, he was part of your elite French society. And we'll go into France on a later video, but you had a large so-called black populace in France. A large. It wasn't small. So what are the facts? Same thing with the Spanish and Portuguese that came over and actually fought against many of your native and indigenous or aboriginal tribes, like the Mississaugas. Okay. They actually fought against Spanish conquistadors and Spanish soldiers that were black men. I showed you pictures of this a few videos ago, I was talking about Thanksgiving. Go back and look at it. You'll find it. What are the facts of subsequent experience has the ultimate failure and result of the struggle of the white race against such unfavorable conditions of life? Algeria became a colony of France in 1835, 1837, when the last province were conquered. Nearly 7 years had passed since the first attempts had been made to conquer the territory. During that time, 6,592 persons of French descent had settled in the new colony, blah, 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 blah. Okay, now there's 16,770 in there. Mr. Look wrote, against the colonization, the population of French descent had increased largely to the course of immigration to 92,750. 20 years later, by this year, the French population is 156,365. All right. During the same periods, most of all the Spanish had settled in Algeria and were increasing at a rapid rate. Now, you guys have to take into consideration the cap. The Jews, who numbered 6,065 in 1867, increased to 21,048 by the year of 1856 to 47,000. So what is this at? Okay, I guess this is settlers. Only the Germans, who numbered 782 in 1837 and 5,400 in 1856, have shown a tendency to decrease in population. Okay, so let me tell you guys the cap with this. Here's a cap. Yes, you be correct. You be correct, Abdullah. He did hate Napoleon. Napoleon did hate Dumas. He hated him with everything he had. That is true. All right. So let me tell you guys the cap. Berbers, they actually went up, your Moors, your Berbers, they went up to Europe, Spain, Portugal, England, specifically Ireland, Scotland. Okay. They had a lust and a desire for so-called white women. They would take them in as concubines, take them in as booty, pun intended. That is a pun intended. And they did this for 400 to 500 years. So you already had Germans, you already had Spanish, you already had British, you already had Welsh, you already had Danish, you already had all these different women that were brought down, unfortunately, through concubinage, slavery, etc., by your Berbers of North Africa. Some looked like me, my complexion. I am not a Berber. I am not from North Africa. I'm just saying, some look like so-called ebony men. Okay, your Berbers, your Moors, and some looked like Rico Suave. Some look like Rico Suave, or what's that singer back in the day? Some look like I don't know. I don't know. Look like Hispanic dudes. I can't think of the guy's name. I was trying to come up with the guys. I can't think of it. Which Mr. Tulla concluded could not possibly survive the early unfavorable conditions of life half a century later, had increased partially to immigration, but in no small part the natural increase of total European population. See, he's super capping because you have migratory paths of so-called Africans from the eastern cradle of civilization all the way up through Europe, and they survived for tens to hundreds of thousands of years in Europe. So he didn't actually understand civilization, its migratory path, its onward progression all the way out from Africa to different areas. And plus, he didn't understand history, okay, human history. And he also is big capping because he knows that looking through royal files, that everywhere you would go, you would see people that look like me, and and the Polynesian islands and the Pacific islands and Southern Asia and Middle East. Well, Middle East was just larger extent Africa, which they would refer to as West Asia sometimes, but it was just part of Africa, from biblical, from Quranic, from Torah. They always discuss that being another extension of Africa, that part they call Middle East. But Europe had a large population of so-called ebony men. I've calculated the ratios of birth to deaths for the period 1881 to 93, which shows that for all Europeans in Algeria, the ratio of one death to every 1.15 births. Those of French have a ratio of 1 to 1.17. So and then he's going to break into the native population. So, oh, here's something interesting. Surgeon, okay, statistics for this part of the population must be a necessity by wanting it, wanting it completeness, wanting incomplete. Okay. Surgeon F.L. Du Bois. Ooh. Now, what does that name sound like? Well, well, Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois, was a Huguenot. Many of you guys know this, and he actually moved over to New Paltz, New York. New Paltz connects to Palatine. Palatines were Boers. Boers were German. Okay, and they were so-called swarthy, tawny, ruddy, so-called ebony, so-called black men. German just means the seed. All right. So for the most part, uh, this might have been one of W.B. Du Bois' ancestors. I will have to look this up. Or someone that was within his familial tree. I don't know, but I'll look it up and I'll get back to you guys. Writing in the 1880s to the Navy Department, expressed in his opinion that the native Muslim population would rapidly disappear. But he's trying to say that so-called black people would disappear. But so far, this has not taken place for a while. At times, the births have fallen below the deaths. At other times, the reverse has occurred. If the race is destined to disappear, it will be a very gradual process of extinction, perhaps increasing, perhaps in rapidity and course over time. Such extinction has been almost invariable by the rule where white races have permanently settled amongst what German called the Navarroka. It would carry me beyond my purpose where I to deal, where I to see, that's what I'm trying to read this stuff. And you got such okay. Carry me beyond my purpose where I to deal, I'm not making this up, to any extent with this point, but on account of the close relation between the extinction of native races in various parts of the world and the settlement of those sections by the white race. Let's look at the chart. So, native Indian population of the United States and Hawaiians and the Maoris. 1822. All right. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, because of all the wars and disease that you're bringing over. All right. Shouts out to King Kauai, who actually pioneered the surfboard. He brought that over to the United States and was confused for a so-called black man. Great documentary on the king of surfing. Really good documentary. I have confined myself in this table periods of observations with statistical data are fairly reliable, to which would tend rather to understand and overstand the native population early periods. It was observed that the annual rate of decrease has been highest in the Maoris, slightly lower than the Hawaiians, about half the rate of the former native Indian population. These figures are interesting for the number of standpoints, but we must confine ourselves to one or two. So, of the Maoris, I need only be said that they lived in the land where the dominant white today enjoys the most favorable rates of mortality of any race on earth, except the Norwegians Norwegians, okay, aka your Nordic people, your Vikings. You really want to go there, people? Of Hawaiians, it is needed only to be said that the very name of the group of the islands, the paradise of the Pacific, indicates the conditions of life must have been favorable for success in the mere struggle of physical existence. Okay, we're getting closer to the end. The American Indians have, without question, been exposed to great hardships in the most unfavorable conditions of life, and only account the enormous increase of the white population, yet the rate of decrease has only been one half of the others. And the reason to become plain if we go a little deeper into the life of these three races. Let's see what he's gonna cap. Yeah, Ricky Martin. Yeah, that's what I was looking for. Yeah, some of them look like Ricky Martin. Yeah. All right. Ricky Martin. Oh, Ricky. Tricky Ricky. All right. All right. So he wrote in 1869 it is frequently asserted that under any circumstance, the natives must disappear before the advance of the European civilization. Basically, they get murked, that they be doomed a race. For the sake of humanity, I trust that some means may be found of terminating the present state of chronic hostilities, so they may still be a fair opportunity to preserve by far the finest and most influential race by whom the Anglo-Saxon colonists have yet to come in contact. Also, cap. There is ample room for both. No wide extent the country is required for hunting grounds, and a glance at the map will show a small portion of the island has yet been appropriated. The Maoris, such as they have been found by the Tasman and Cook, no longer exist. They were people, great force of character, superior intellectual powers, and it's proper that their memory should be perpetuated. From the descendants are no longer the typical representatives of the ancestral stock. They are degenerate offspring of superior people who within a longer or shorter period will become entirely extinct. Why is that? Because, they were, some of the Europeans were sleeping with the natives, and they were just, just disease and wars and things like that. It is what it is. Okay. Fenton. I knew somebody named Fenton. So I believe that is a name that is very popular amongst Jamaica. Shouts out to my Jamaicans out there. But Fenton goes all the way back to Europe, specifically. I want to say Ireland. It could be Scotland. I have to look that name up in a second. Okay. Similar abundance of fertile soil, extreme facility in obtaining the necessities of existence, a climate of either graded celebrity than the United States placed the aboriginal inhabitants of this island in circumstances of similar advantage for development of the utmost, the powers of rapid increase possessed by the human race generally. So you're trying to say it was favorable. Of the Hawaiians, we have so many accounts that it is extremely difficult to select descriptive statements that would not contradict others of equal value from the standpoint of personal observation. What is he trying to say in this? Okay, brothers, we're getting through. We're about to be through in less than 10 minutes. So, a footnote of Hawaiian history speaks of the race at times of the missionary statements. Missionaries are not really missionaries, they're there really to indoctrinate. They usually send in missionaries first, scope out the land, convert people over to religious belief. And often they couldn't actually go in under different laws that your papal decrees had actually stayed down. Let's see, people were pagans and they were cannibals and things of that nature. So missionaries be sent in not really for good reasons. Incomparable physique, open heart, generous, hospitable to a fault. Yep. They had a land of abundance. Thus, because they had a land of abundance, they're very hospitable. Whereas you had a very, very hood mentality that most of Europeans brought over because they came from scarcity. All right. So their goal was to try to steal, rob, breach contracts, etc., because they felt as though this was divine, I guess, religious, whatever. So discovered no such custom or weakness, that the women were weak and willing to submit to irregular sexual relations with the whites is not to be doubted. So basically saying your women were hoes. They're out there getting it in. Has much changed? I don't know. The women were, they wanted to hook up with these natives. Oh, they so cute. Look at them. That's what they thought. Racist, if it were otherwise, this, however, would prove nothing further than that whites who came to the island were not slow to take advantage of the childlike ignorance of the woman. Oh, shoot, my fault. Went to the wrong page. All right, where was that? Childlike ignorance of the woman or the foolish vanity of the men. In other words, Mr. Fedman, we're proud of the attention shown to intimate relations, cultivating the better halves when visiting or distinguished strangers claim their hospitality. So basically, trying to say your women were foolish, childlike, ignorant. They worship different deities. Some worshipped, you know, assortment of different religious beliefs, but they had an abundance. So they didn't really have that mentality where some were like, you want to buy the land? Go ahead. Okay. You can't buy land. So their mentality was that they had a mentality of abundance and fair dealings. And they had long houses where they would live in. They had civilizations. They had a system of underground tunnels, cultivation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But however, they were a little bit too nice. But the woman, as they said, the women were kind of foolish and childlike. Well, so they call it the Paradise of the Pacific. Under the influence of the missionary efforts for more than 70 years, is that 70 or is that 70 years, subject to all the religious and educational influences prevailing amongst the white race, indoctrination, and practically under complete influence of preachers and teachers, the race dying out at a rate which will make it complete extinction only a question of a few years. All the disease ran riot in their shattered constitutions. They became especially incapacitated to resist pulmonary maladies. Their greatly increased prevalence of colds and consumption. Consumption is basically alcohol. That's mean drinking. Is doubtless due to the syphilic, diathesis, rather than to change of habits as to clothing, although latter may have some unfavorable effects. So basically, they were getting these dudes drunk. They were passing different diseases and ailments along to them intentionally, different illnesses. So we go unchastity. So basically, they were just smashing these women. It is not therefore any unfavorable conditions of life, but a race trait, an inordinate amount of sexual immorality. Mr. Bishop attributes the downward tendencies of the race. A race, he adds, well worth saving. With all the sad frailties, they are a noble race of men, physical and moral. They are manly, courageous, enterprising, cordial, generous, blah, blah, blah. They are highly receptive of good. Should the Hawaiian people leave no posterity, their very sweet, generous, interesting race will have been lost to the world. Okay, North American Indians has seen at times very troublesome factor in the growth of the American nation. Yeah, they kept on warring against you, so-called black men. Years of strife has reduced his original habitation to very limited reservations. Quite a bit of your paternal tribes were at war on a constant basis. Maternal tribes were a little bit more receptive. Now, in order to understand maternal tribes, it was very difficult in the past for people to actually trace the heritage of a family. They'll say, oh, well, is that such and such's kid? They can trace that it came from that woman. So they say, oh, well, that came from that woman. Okay, so you have a completely different concept of what maternal tribes were. All right. People think that it was women ruling. No, it's just they were able to trace the progeny of those kids through the mother because they can physically see her have the kids. So that's why you get a lot of the tribes that had maternalistic familial lineage, how they would trace their lineage that way. So the men were still in control of different societies in some of these maternal tribes. It wasn't some gynocracy like you have in today's modern day society. However, it was easier for a lot of these colonialists to actually deal with the maternal tribes because the maternal tribes that trace their ancestry through the father, which just means that the fathers had control of the family after the children got to a certain age, specifically the boys, and they'd be taken away. And they would go through their different customs, different tribes of manhood. So it is what it is. They just kept on aggressing and kept on fighting against a lot of the European colonists. And that's not good for business. Okay, most of which were constantly being encroached upon by aggressive white population. Agreed. Few races have made such a brave struggle for their own preservation. Few races can boast to such high degree of aboriginal civilization. If the race had produced nothing better than the League of Iroquois, it would have left a mark and indelible imprints on the history of the human race. The race made a brave and persistent struggle, but all to no avail. So the Iroquois fought vehemently against so-called white people. They were having no interest in contracts and treaties. Is that not no, I don't think so. Nope. And they should start warring against them. So you can read in Bury My Heart and Wounded Knee of all the different contracts and treaties that were breached. But it doesn't have all of them. You also had quite a few other books that I've actually read. You got to go back and look at those videos. Those who had the opportunity to study the original paintings in the Catling Gallery of the Indian portraits must have been struck by one predominant trait. Let's see what he's talking about. In Indian continents, a trait met with nearly every instance, from chief ever so humble and the mightiest who fame still lingers. An iron will can be traced upon the countenance of nearly every Indian of note. That trait, a race trait, is still met with the faces of Sitting Bull, the Sioux chief, Pi, the Ute chief, Tamasket, the Nez chief, Kiko, the Sac and Fox chief, Whitebird, the Crow Indian, still showed the inflexible, unbending nature of the Indians of long ago. Notice he didn't actually talk about the Confederation of Seminole. Seminole is really a collection of different tribes in Florida. Okay, they all forged together. He doesn't talk about the Gullahs. Man, he really won't talk about the Gullahs. He doesn't talk about the Choctaw. He doesn't talk about the Mississaugas. He doesn't talk about the different Ohio Valley Native Indigenous people or persons. He doesn't talk about the Shawnees. He doesn't talk about the Crees. He doesn't talk about some of the California tribes. He doesn't talk about them because they look like you, so-called black man. He doesn't talk about some of the different tribes in the Louisiana and the Boot. Okay. So some of your Seminoles actually became scouts for the Army. Again, we talked about that earlier, U.S. Army. And they helped in in numerous wars to help scout, to protect landmass and things of that nature. And they also did actually fight in different wars here in American history on behalf of the Army. So that's neither here nor there. The most subtle agency of all the... Oh, let's go back. Let's see, where did I leave off at? So we're about to end this, brothers. So this is coming up to the end. I told you I'm gonna finish it. The race could never be permanent enslaved. That is correct. It could never be brought to accept the customs and ways of the white race. That would be correct. Subtle methods. And there was 500,000 or more so-called freedmen during the time that slavery ended, that were living in different cities. All right. So, you have to incorporate a lot of colored people and not mulattoes, but they would classify Native Indigenous people as mulattoes, but they would usually just say colored or Negro. So when you're on the reservation, you were Native American. When you're off, you were Negro. So neither poison of unadulterated whiskey nor the frightful consequence of sexual morality spread amongst the forts and settlements of the white. That's a cap. Were sufficient, the most subtle agency of all, governmental pauperism, the highest development of the theory of easy conditions of life. What neither drink nor the poisons of venereal diseases, also a cap, could do. Today, the most large majority of tribes are following the Maoris and Hawaiian traditions or towards the goal of final extinction, also a cap. There are exceptions, and it is exceptions that we find the most emphatic lessons. The fact of which following the table of space have been part obtained from two valuable papers of the genetic, see, N properly wrote that, Notes Among the Indians, contributed by Dr. A. B. Holden, former agency physician to the Journal of Obstetricians, part of the reports of the Commission of Indian Affairs. I've selected 2 years, 1882 and 1895, for comparative purpose. The prevailing degree of chastity and prevalence of venereal disease. Okay. All right. Mm-hmm. And in Oregon, they didn't really want so-called black people there. So until World War II, black people really weren't allowed there except for the native indigenous populace. So tribes have in common intercourse with whites. Okay. All right. All right. Crows. Okay. That's not looking good for white people if you're looking at it, because, hey, it is what it is. All right, let's go on to the next page. Retain their tribal relations and declare for non-intercourse or chaste and free from taint. The tribes who have opened their arms to receive the white man or who have been seduced by him have been debauched and inculcated. This plain and emphatic condemnation of intercourse between unlike races or attempts at their amalgamation in the violation of the law of similarity is supported by the table below, which shows that while the tribes have little to no illicit intercourse with the white race, are holding their own, making slight gains in population to those who have opened their arms to receive the white man, have decreased to nearly one half their number during the short period of 13 years. Hence, the decrease in Indian population is due largely to rapid decrease among certain tribes, while others are holding their own or gaining slowly year by year. These instances of the results of the intimate contact of lower races, those of much higher degree of cultural morality, would suffice to show the preponderance, or what's the prepondering influence of race and struggle for life. Given the same conditions of life for two races, the one of the Aryan descent will prove superior solely on the account of its ancient inheritance of virtue and transmitted qualities, which are determining factors suggesting race supremacy. The lower races, even under the same conditions of life, must necessarily fail because the vast number of capabilities which a hard struggle for life has eliminated from the ranks of the white race are still forming a large body of lower races. Easy conditions of life and liberal chastity or liberal charity are amongst the most destructive influences amongst the lower races. The two essential virtues of modern progress, self-reliance and chastity, have not been the result of easy conditions of life. Self-reliance of the Anglo-Saxon race is a result of struggle of ages rather than of book education and mystery. That's not true. Again, he doesn't understand what Saxon is. And I might actually do a video on what a Saxon really is. So that's a cap. No missionary or educator or philanthropist extended aid to comfort the English peasant class during its darkest days. Really? Through the sword, you were brought to Catholicism and Christianity in Europe, and the ones that weren't were actually kicked out. Okay. So we all know what happened with that. Some were burnt, like your witches in Europe were actually burnt at the stake. Yep. Early settlers of the coast of New England and some of your people that believed in Islam were also burnt, killed, imprisoned. Okay. You either created heresy or you submitted to whatever the religion was that was being pushed by your ruling class. History is the repeat with the instances of men, women emerging from the most unfortunate conditions of life, but it is extremely rare to find cases where conditions of life or liberal charity have assisted man in his upward struggle. Self-reliance Okay, we keep on using that word, and that's the whole pull yourself up by your bootstrap. Not so. You have a period of American history during the Depression where you had to actually have strong social networks to actually maintain the property which was being taken, because a lot of the land that was given with land allotments, with handouts, was being lost and was being taken back by large banks. One is which you talk about the 7-year balloon payment loans for property, and a lot of so-called white people could not afford them. And the property and land went back into receivership, and the banks took them back. And they said, "Oh no, 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 we can't have that. We can't have that." So they end up stopping 7-year balloon payments, and they end up giving all types of different ease of access to credit, different uh, loans. For instance, FHA made it segregative. They would not allow so-called, if it was so equal and if you're so superior, then you would need advantages and handouts and set asides. Just saying. So, the study of race traits and tendencies of the Negro in America may explain the failure of modern education. I can agree with that. Modern education is failing, but it's intended to. And I did a video, numerous videos on your education, the deliberate dumbing down of America. Read that. I believe I ended off in the 1970s. I think. I can go back and check. Yep, I left off in the 1970s. So go check that out. But yes, it's meant to fail. It's meant to indoctrinate. Working class, who do you think invests in your education? Well, your industrialists. And what do they want? Workers. They want thinkers, without which no race has ever yet been able to gain a permanent civilization, easing conditions of life, a liberal construction of the doctrine of forgiveness of sins, and unwarranted extension of the principles of state of private interference in the conduct of individual life have never yet raised a race of individuals from a lower or higher plane. On the contrary, the world's failures are largely those of race and individuals, and whose existence the struggle for a higher life has practically come to an end. Okay. And we're finishing this up. Now, civilization is really wanted. The downward tendencies of the colored race, therefore, can only be asserted by radical and far reaching changes in the moral nature. Instead of clamoring for aid and assistance from the white race, the Negro himself should sternly refuse every offer of direct interference in his own evolution. All right, so this is more of the evolution of the human race by Darwin. Okay, so Darwin, who's quite a racist, actually, the full title of the book talked about why all other races are inferior. The more difficult his upward struggle, the more enduring will be the qualities developed. Most of all, there must be a more general recognition of the institution of uh, monogamy and marriage. Now, monogamy, uh, specifically monogamy and marriage, you have ancient Hebrews that believe you can have multiple wives. People that believe in Islam, you can have multiple wives. Now, monogamy was actually a population control tactic actually done to make sure that most Europeans could actually have a wife. You have very harsh winter periods. They needed to keep their population growing due to different diseases and ailments and things and wars. So they devised that system, which, okay, but they're trying to say that so-called black men are immoral and they should actually stick to one partner for life. All right. And you have numerous uh, civilizations that had men that had one wife, numerous. And you had those that had multiple wives. They both actually existed at the same time. Some actually grew, some did not. It doesn't matter. It depends on military resources, ease of access of weaponry, okay, ability to expand, healthy population, which means you have to have sanitary, necessary transportation of goods and services, roads, aqueducts. You know, a lot of things are essential for a society to thrive. The arrangement of the family system is the most important and vital. And once you destroy the family, you destroy that society. But it is what it is with that. And unqualified reprobation of those that violate law and sexual morality. We really don't want to go to Europe and their concept of sexual morality because, you know, they actually had buildings and religious cults dedicated to the expression of love between both men and men. Okay. They had friezes and paintings all over Europe dedicated towards sexual immorality. But intercourse with the white race must absolutely cease, and race purity, see, there you go, right there. He's all about race purity. It's a battle cry of the undesirable. Of the undesirable must be insisted upon in marriage as well as outside of it. Together with higher morality will come a greater degree of economic efficiency and predominating trait of the white race. The virtue of thrift will follow with natural consequences the mastery by the colored race of all its conditions of life. The compensation of such independent struggle will be the race of people who will gain a place among civilized mankind, will increase and multiply instead of dying out with loathsome disease. The day is not far distant when the worlds of Mr. Kidd, the last thing of civilization, is likely to permanently tolerate the waste of resources of richest regions of earth through the lack of elementary qualities of social efficiency of the races possessing them. When the ever-increasing white population has reached a stage where new conquests are necessary, we will not hesitate to make our war upon those races who will prove themselves useless factors in the progress of mankind. A race may be interesting, gentle, and hospitable, but if it is not a useful race in the common acceptance, or what is it, acceptation of the term, it is only a question of time when the downward course must take place. All the facts brought together in the work prove that the colored population is gradually parting with virtues and moderate degree of economic efficiency developed under the regime of slavery. All the facts prove that a low standard of sexual morality and the main underlying cause of low antisocial conditions of the race at the present time. All the facts prove that education, philanthropy, and religion have failed to develop a higher appreciation of the system and uncompromising virtues of the Aryan race. Again, he doesn't know what Aryan is. The conclusion is warranted that it is merely a question of time when the actual downward course, that is the decrease in population, will take place. In the meantime, however, the presence of the colored population is a serious hindrance to the economic progress of the white race. Instead of making the more independent, modern educational philanthropic, why did you just say philanthropy? Philanthropic efforts have succeeded in the making and even more dependent on the white race at the present time than its previous on emancipation. It remains to be seen how far the knowledge of facts about its own diminishing vitality, low state of morality, and economic efficiency will stimulate the race adopting higher standards. Unless a change takes place, a change that will strike the fundamental errors that underlie the conduct of the higher races towards the lower gradual extinction, is only a question of time. That is the end. Thank you guys for tuning in. A mere hour and 30. All right. So this book is just rife with racism. It is what it is. He believes what he believes. And that's okay. He's long gone. Good for him. I don't think I can sit back and listen to him pontificate about a bunch of malarkey. Because that's what he did. He pontificates about a bunch of malarkey. Let's minimize that. There you go. So this is the end. For the most part, what he discussed in his last chapter was that, education is just not going to help. And they're not hardworking, diligent enough to create their own civilizations. That's not true. Civilization existed all throughout Africa. Your first cities actually have their formation in Africa. However, in some African civilizations, you have some individuals that don't understand concept of proper hygiene. So you have some nomadic civilizations that exist in Africa, right? And he would say, "Oh, they're just, they make these simple housing. They're not permanent." But he doesn't understand European history is rife with disease. It's rife with let's switch that back over. It's rife with disease. It's rife with all types of unclean drinking water. It's rife with unsanitary situations. Whereas they're actually using high level understanding of human interaction, and they're also using high social cues for sanitary policies, where they would just literally, after a couple months, they would just put all their waste and stuff in holes, cover it up, and move to a new site. And they were actually quite healthy for thousands upon thousands of years by doing this, because they would never stay static at one specific spot and allow disease and bowel and all sorts of different hepatitis and all sorts of different diseases affect them, because they weren't pushing around muck and filth. In Europe, the stone buildings, people would throw their waste out the buildings, out the rooms, onto the ground underneath. So you had muckrakers that would actually push, the fecal matter and stuff off of the streets, and they would actually develop clogs in different shoes so they wouldn't step on the stuff. So you had very unsanitary situations. You had rivers that were clogged up with animal skins and fats in France, and instead of fast flowing rivers and bodies of water, it was just static and all types of diseases and germs. And this would be their drinking water also. Okay. Different leather makers, different butchers would just drop the entrails into the water source where you would drink water from. Showering was something done once a month. So the use of different perfumes and scents and powders were necessary to mask the stench that people would actually have. So sanitary wise, not the healthiest. Okay, let's switch that banner. So sanitary wise, they weren't the healthiest. Okay, and these unhealthy patterns of behavior and actions actually carried over to America. And you had a lot of wars. So you had a lot of civilizations that developed housing, cities. Of course, you have some very famous cities. You look at the libraries and the universities, specifically in Shanghai and Mali. You look at, they had a pension system, a retirement system for the professors. This was all the way before they actually expanded out all the way through Europe to the Americas. Of course, in the United States, you had numerous cities that were established, some of which you had walls and buildings and structures. Specifically, let's look at Texas. So you had long houses on the eastern shore, and you had different buildings made of stone and brick. And you had the extension of the Aztec population that went all the way up to Texas and New Mexico. And the Aztecs were so-called ebony men. Of course, there are some principles and things that they worship that were polytheistic, but you have some that worship some of the old gods. Okay. And they had buildings and structures. And in certain towns in Texas, they would take these buildings in stone and they just built right on top of them. Right on top of them. And they would just name them different things. And sometimes they would take apart these buildings and beautiful structures and temples and homes, and they would use it to make their own personal boundary fences. Don't take my word for it. Look up in Texas, historic towns that were actually broken apart and people use it for their own personal gates. A lot of history has been intentionally overlooked. California had a lot of indigenous people and persons that established cities and towns, and it actually had quite a bit of agriculture that later was just taken over. All right. Parts of the Mississippi Valley region had all types of road systems and all types of valleys and underground pasture systems along the Mississippi. that trade would actually occur. So they had trade, they had centers of worship, they had sport games from lacrosse to different games of which they would actually on temples in Mexico and part of Southern America, Southwest. They had temples that had were built specifically for sport games. They had rituals, they had customs, they had everything. So I don't know what he's talking about. I don't know what he's talking about. And one thing that's intentionally overlooked is the fact that numerous civilizations that rose up, and when so-called white people came in, they brought and black, because you did have black conquistadors, you did have black Spanish, black Portuguese, you had black French. I mean, hell, I mean, you look at Delaware, it was actually founded by the Swedes. It's the Swedish. So yeah, a lot of times they'll bring in these very disease-ridden people, and before they would get to these towns and areas, it'd be completely evacuated because people would have been died out because they were spreading all these type of diseases, and this unsanitary health standards that they would bring in actually affected the people. They'd just be dead before they'd even get there. So it is what it is. Okay, he's a super capper. It's filled with all the type of lies. And this is a guy that helped influence your insurance. He helped, and he was pushed by numerous publishers in England and United States. Some of it was translated into German. It was taught in that world famous school in Berlin, which actually helped teach a lot of Marxists. And it is what it is. Okay, his research was used to push a lot of pseudoscience. Before The Birth of a Nation film came out, you had books, pseudo literature, pseudoscience. You had phrenology. You had the study of different cultures based on physical features, not just with the skull. Phrenology is with the skull. You had a lot of different things that were used to justify the superiority of the so-called Aryan race. And again, I might do a video on what the Aryan race really is, and Anglo-Saxons, what Saxon really is, and what Germans really were ancestrally. I might do a video on that, but it's going to take me going and looking at a coat of arms. Okay. So I have to actually go and look in books like this, okay, which has different family crest. Let's go to that. Okay, let's look at the screen. So you would have to actually look into books like this. Okay. So this is a book of different family coat of arms and family crest. So you have this individual right up there, and you have to actually, and some of these are so-called black men, black families that trace their ancestry back to European royalty, et cetera, et cetera. So you would have to actually go and look through books like this. So here's another one. So they're just not going to put a black figurehead on their coat of arms, their family coat of arms. So these are Germans, some of them are British. All right. So you have to actually do a lot of research, and that's going to take a lot of time. Let's zoom into that. Boop, boop. There you go. Can you guys see that? Voila. So you have to actually do a lot of research, and you have to actually go and break things down. I'll show you different documentaries. Let's expand that a little bit. Boom. So you have to actually go and look at different documentaries, go in different coat of arms, family crest. You have to look up different histories. And that would literally take me about 5 to 7 hours to do all that. Not to research it, I mean to put it out for you guys to actually see what I'm talking about. So that would be a very comprehensive video, and I just don't have time to have all the haters and trolls come out. What are you talking about? Yeah, that might be a family coat of arms, but they weren't black. That's just they don't even look black to me. Okay, all right, fine. That's what you want to say. All right. But this is the end of the broadcast. Hope you guys have a good day. I'm out.